I'm going to start off by saying that you're going to hear a lot of the same messages in multiple ways this morning, and we didn't plan that. That was not on purpose. So, for the interest of time, I have a lot that I want to talk about. And if you were at my talk yesterday, I tend to get very passionate and long-winded about things that I want to talk about. So we'll just get started. If you think back to Dr. Wiegand's slides this morning, like I said, I promise we didn't collude. Market motivation right now, at least for the commercial cattlemen, is pounds, right? And he talked about, he and I were in the office on Wednesday kind of talking about this issue of the market says to feed cattle. So the grid on the left-hand side it is a recent grid, I think from around June. I stole it from another presentation, but hot carcass weights continue to go higher and higher, right? Because the discount's not there to say, stop feeding these cattle. And if you combine that with the fact that there's almost no yield grade 4 discounts, the market is saying to feed cattle more. And how do we get cattle heavier with more fat? We feed them longer, right? And so I borrowed this from BIF this year. Ty Lawrence likes to show this graph here. I guess I have to use he likes to show this graph here on the left-hand side where the bottom is days on feed and then the up is just like carcass transfer as a function of days on feed. So what I really want you to take out of this is, yes, the data says that as we go from 150 to 250 to 350 days on feed, animals are converting feed to weight. I'm not going to argue that point. They will always convert feed to weight, and they appear to stay above that magic 3 pounds of gain per day. But where is that weight going? Okay, when we know cattle reach a mature point and they stop putting on carcass weight or ribeye area, where does it go? It goes to subcutaneous fat. And what happens at the packer when they get a lot of excess subcutaneous fat? It goes in the trash, right? And so we have to make sure, yes, they're gaining pounds, but what are the pounds that they're gaining? And outside of from the feed yard standpoint, for the people sitting in this room and your commercial bull buyers, unless you retain ownership, even if you background cattle, unless you retain ownership through the feed yard and sell on a grid, which by the way is not that common, what is your motivation? What is the producer's motivation? And regardless, whether it's an end product or selling a weaned calf or a long yearling, your motivation should still be the cow, okay? Because like Allison said, that is your factory. That is what produces the product day in and day out that keeps you in business. So I went and I looked at some genetic trends for cow weight, okay? The one on the left, Angus has a mature weight EPD. And what you're looking at is the genetic trend for mature weight from, I think, 1972 all the way to 2024. And by my math, that's 160 pounds of mature cow weight, okay? Now, if I go to Angus, Red Angus, and Simmental, and I pull their genetic trends for yearling weight. Now, we know EPDs aren't comparable. So what I did is I went in and I said, well, if Angus's mature or yearling weight EPD went from 60 to 61, that's a 1 pound change. So what you're looking at on the axis of that is the pounds of change per year. Those lines are almost identical, okay? Regardless of breed, we are increasing cow size. On the same time, I borrowed this slide from Dave Laltman. He presented this at BIF 2 years ago, okay? If we look at year on the bottom and then federally inspected carcass weights on the y-axis, bull, steer, heifer, cow, we can see that those carcass weights are creeping higher and higher. And he did the math to the tune of about 7.3 pounds of mature cow weight per year. Okay, that's real. That's real data. So I get up, I agree with Allison that it's hard to get up and talk about mature weight, but it's important. Okay, why do we talk about it? Well, because the cow-calf phase accounts for 74% of the total feed required to produce 1 pound of carcass weight. Okay, that's huge. Resource availability at the cow-calf phase has a huge input into final carcass availability. Okay, and the reason that we need to think of that as it relates to mature cow weights, there was a paper published in 2008 that says from 1975 to 20 years ago, cow weights increased by 30%. Okay? Now, if you guys are familiar with US mark data, I went in and I looked at, you know that they have that germplasm evaluation cow herd where they compare breeds of cattle against each other. Okay, because they have the ability and they're doing all of the crossbreeding and things to manage those breed effects. And in, I think it was 2002, they published some data that said breed of sire differences, okay, in that middle column, what you're looking at is that Angus is a base, those pounds are breed of sire difference, okay, for weight. Compare how those breeds ranked in 1970 to a second paper that looked at the direct breed effect for mature weight in cows in 2019. Look how those breeds re-rank. Okay? We are driving British breeds of cattle to meet continental cattle. There is no effect of British versus continental anymore. We have big cows. Okay? They're big and they're getting bigger. And there's also data that says that a 30% larger cow will consume 22 to 28% more forage dry matter daily. Okay? Mature cow weight matters. So this is a little example that I like to do. It's a study that was done by Lawman and some others down in Oklahoma, and they just did the basic math, okay? Because the one question I always get when I talk about mature cow size is, yeah, Jamie, but my bigger cows wean heavier calves. Okay, not a trick question. That's true, okay? So if you look at the data here on the graph, we've got heifers and steers. The yellow bar is calves born to cows that weighed 1,100 pounds on average. The black bar is calves born to cows that weighed 1,400 pounds, okay? Larger cows wean heavier calves. But is this the right question we should be asking ourselves? My question that I like to ask is, are larger cows as efficient as more moderate-sized cows? So to explain this, in this study, they looked at how does mature cow size impact stocking rate. So at 1,100 pounds, the more moderate-sized cows, you could put 100 of them on the same acreage of grass, right? And it makes sense that a heavier cow at 1,400 pounds, you could only put 76 of them. So resource availability, because you had heavier cows, you have less of them in the same area. And so if we think about that, if they all weaned a calf, if magically they all weaned a live calf, then the moderate-sized cows would wean 24 more calves, but they only weighed 500 pounds, okay? That looks like 12,000 pounds. Now, the 76 cows total weaned 100 additional pounds of weaning weight compared to the moderate-sized cows. So yeah, they weaned heavier calves, but they weaned less of them. That's less than 10,000 pounds of additional weaning weight, okay? A lot of times when we think about mature cow size and weaning weights of calves, we think of them on an individual animal basis. It would be the same as this slide here where I say, what's worth more on an individual basis? A quarter or a dime? Not a trick question, right? The quarter is worth more on an individual animal basis. But what if I asked you the same question now? Which is worth more? Okay? Yes, heavier calves make money, but if we think about resource availability, fixed resources, more moderate cow size and lighter weaning weights is not always a bad thing. Now, for the interest of time, I took out one of my favorite slides here, but I'm going to echo Allison's sentiments. I'm not saying all of our cows need to be 900 pounds, but I like to use the term intermediate optimum a lot, okay? I think of that in terms of milk production, in terms of docility, right? There are things where an intermediate optimum is great. I don't want to fear for my life or my child's life when I go to tag a calf, but I also want to be able to get her through the chute when it comes time to breed her, right? That's annoying. But it's becoming more, the data show that mature cow size is an intermediate optimum trait. And outside of other data, what I want to tell you is that time and time again, that 1,100 to 1,200 pounds is a sweet spot, okay? The key is just to avoid the cows that are over 1,400 pounds and are consuming more nutrients than they're providing you in profit at the end of the day, okay? So the next question is, okay, Jamie, well, from a commercial producer standpoint, the market is telling me I need increased calf performance, but you're telling me to have a smaller, more moderate sized cow with less calf performance. How do we balance that, right? So calf performance, just like the example of the quarter versus a dime, I don't want us to think of it as the weight of an individual calf, okay? I like to use terms like pound weaned per cow exposed. And one of my favorites since I've moved to Missouri is pounds weaned per acre. Let's think about our cow herd as a system, as a whole, instead of an individual animal. And so the first thing, and you heard me touch on this a little bit yesterday, but I give a whole presentation on the importance of making sure that the cow herd matches their environment. The first thing is mature cow size, right? Because that directly impacts stocking rates, that directly impacts her ability to breed back and come back and perform year after year. And then the second one I touched on, remember yesterday, is hair shedding, right? There are management things, there are selection things that we can do to make sure that the dam is performing at her optimum potential, right? Outside of nutrition, there's genetic things like hair shedding, to the tune of 45 pounds of weaning weight on an individual calf. Now, the other thing that when I give these presentations is, I never touched on it, and then the question I would always get is, yeah, but Jamie, can you talk a little bit about how we're seeing birth weights in calves get smaller and smaller, and resulting in a failure to thrive, right? And then the first question I always ask them is, do you look at calving ease direct and calving ease maternal, or do you look at birth weight? Okay, so I want to tell you a story. When I dug into this, I borrowed this picture from Dr. Martinez. I don't want to ruin his talk later. I thought he was going to get a little bit more in detail this morning. But time and time again, producers think that birth weight is equivalent to calving ease, especially on the commercial side, okay? They're always saying, well, I want to select for a low birth weight bull because I don't want to pull calves. If you look, as an example, I borrowed this from his presentation at BIF, but what you can see, basically his eye detection technology will kind of do a heat map of where people's eyes go. And if we print EPDs in this order, which they were in his project, it's always calving ease direct, birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight. Look at that heat map. What are producers looking at? They're not looking at calving ease. I went to the American Simmental Association and I pulled down the definitions of these traits, okay? If we select for birth weight, we select for low birth weight, we select for pounds of weight at birth. It's not, not a trick. That is what the birth weight EPD predicts. Now, look at the definitions for calving ease direct and calving ease maternal. Reported is the difference in the probability of calves being born unassisted out of what? First calf heifers. That's a whole nother soapbox I may or may not get on in a minute. Calving ease maternal. Reported is the difference in probability of daughters calving unassisted as what? First calf heifers. I ask everyone in this room, what are you and your commercial bull buyers actually wanting to select for? or what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to accomplish lower birth weight calves? Or are you trying to decrease dystocia in your first calf heifers? Okay? They're not the same trait. And if we're selecting for lower birth weights, similar to what Allison said earlier, what repercussions arise when we start having calves born at 55, 50, 40 pounds? Okay? There are lots of negative repercussions as a result of that. So I went again into the literature and I looked at people who had investigated the relationship between calving ease and birth weights. You might be surprised. They're all heritable traits, right? So we've got on that diagonal the heritabilities of calving ease, percent of assisted births, birth weight, and gestation length. Those are pretty awesome heritabilities. There is a genetic component to these traits, which means we can select for them. But if we look at the correlation, the genetic correlation between birth weight and calving ease, it's only 0.3, which means genetically they're related, but they're not the same trait. More importantly, if you look at the correlation between calving ease direct and percent of assisted births, guys, that genetic correlation is 0.91. Compared to, if we're just selecting for low birth weight, the genetic correlations to percent of assisted births is only 0.24. When we select for dystocia problems and we select for low birth weight, we are not solving the problem. We're creating a new one, okay? And so my take home for this is that selection for birth weight does not ensure calving ease. It just creates light calves, okay? We need to be having these tough conversations with our commercial buyers that says, I understand you want to reduce dystocia in your first calf heifers, but that doesn't always mean birth weight, right? They're not the same trait. And so remember, that genetic correlation is only 0.33. So the other reason, you're like, okay, well, what does that have to do with actual pounds weaned, right? Well, the reason this is even more important is if you go and you look at the relationship between calving ease direct or birth weight with growth traits, you see a similar story. So here we have weaning weight on the left, yearling weight on the right, and the genetic correlation, the height of the bar is the genetic correlation. Look at the relationship between birth weight and weaning weight, 0.6, birth weight and yearling weight, 0.57. Does that make sense? If you're lighter at birth, you're lighter at weaning. If you're lighter at weaning, you're lighter at yearling time. That's essentially a genetic correlation. That makes sense. But remember, the relationship between birth weight and calving ease is low. So if we are actually selecting for calving ease, the relationship between calving ease and weaning weight, much lower. Relationship between calving ease and yearling weight, much lower. If we instead change our mindset from selecting for low birth weight to selecting for actual calving ease, by default, we're going to increase the weaning weight of our calves. Because you can calve out heifers just fine at a 60-pound birth weight most of the time, as long as they're developed correctly, okay? And if they're 60 pounds at birth, they're gonna be heavier at weaning, okay? Increasing profitability without increasing mature cow size, okay? So here in the state of Missouri, we have what's called Show Me Select. If you don't know about it, it's kind of a how the state of Missouri or how people at the University of Missouri recommend that heifers be developed. We then breed those heifers to calving ease bulls because they're first calf heifers, right? And then we sell them as bred heifers. And because of that, my role with Show Me to Select is to set the genetic requirement that each of the bulls used, either via AI or natural service, have to qualify to ensure that when those heifers are purchased and go somewhere else, they birth without dystocia issues, okay? And so setting that It has a lot of kind of reasons behind it, but essentially what we attempt to do is to set the point at which there is a higher probability of that heifer calving without dystocia problems. And I set that just arbitrarily, just so you know, it's different among breeds, but for IGS, which would be Simmental as well as Red Angus, that point is plus 14. So the board 2 years ago looked at me and said, well, could you explain to us how you come up with that plus 14? And I said, yes. So I went to the Red Angus Association and they gave me the data that I needed to kind of put this graph together. And so what you can see is that this bottom bar here is the sire's calving ease EPD, okay? And in Red Angus's data, in highly used influential AI sires with high accuracy, this is the proportion of unassisted births to heifers born of those sires. And what you see is once you get to a calving ease direct EPD of plus 14, there is a 95% of heifers have calves born unassisted, which means there's only a 5% chance of a dystocia issue. So again, just like mature weight, unless you are having dystocia problems in your heifers, is a calving ease direct EPD above plus 14 even necessary? Right? If we can ensure that 95% of the time heifers will be born unassisted with a calving ease EPD of plus 14, do you need to buy a bull with a calving ease EPD of plus 20? No. And then the other question that I will ask is, as cows age, especially past that second calf, do we even need to worry about the calving ease EPD of the sire we breed her to? Now, I will always argue calving ease maternal is important in those breedings, but do we really need to worry about her own calving ease? At that point, she's probably got it covered, right? And so we need to start, again, thinking about calving ease not as a more is more type trait, because just like birth weight, if we keep selecting for more lower birth weight, more calving ease, it ends up in our cows anyway, and we just create this building up of a genetic problem, okay? And lastly, you guys know this just as well as anybody. Crossbreeding and mating systems will increase the resources we can have while keeping our cow size moderated. So if you've ever seen Bob Weber give a talk, you've seen this slide. It's not new, right? And again, this is US mark data back in 1980. Guys, we proved heterosis and crossbreeding worked in 1980, and you know, we've been kind of trucking along ever since. But we know that crossbred cows raising crossbred calves wean over 23% more weaning weight per cow exposed, okay? Now, they split that into what's attributed to the fact that the calf is crossbred, and it's only a third of it. Most of it comes from the fact that that cow herself is crossbred, okay? Now, we know that while crossbreeding impacts weaning weight, it also more importantly impacts the more lowly heritable traits. So if we think about that 2/3 is attributed to the dam herself being crossbred, right? I didn't say each individual cow weaned a heavier calf. I said that the crossbred calves weaned more weight per cow exposed, right? Well, don't you think those crossbred cows, probably more of them got pregnant and more of them had a calf? Okay? It's better to have a live 500-pound calf at weaning than a dead one at birth, or never having one at all, right? So I'm going to kind of transition into a thought process for seed stock breeders, but mostly for the commercial side. And I want us to start going back to traditional genetics concepts of mating systems and breed complementarity, okay? Why does Sim Angus exist? Because there is breed complementarity between what the Simmental brings to the table and what an Angus animal brings to the table. There is complementarity there, right? The simple example I always use is Herefords are known to bring the maternal and the milk and the resiliency. maternal things that we need to the table, and Angus brings the carcass quality. That is that breed complementary to bring that true package, especially into a feed yard. So, I want us to start. Mark Tallman gave a presentation one time, and I can't remember through all the specific details, but basically the concept is we keep trying to breed cows that do everything. We keep trying to create bulls that do everything. And I understand that that's a good concept to have, but my challenge to everyone in this room is how many people have ever seen a bodybuilder run the Boston Marathon? There is different genetic potential that creates those types of athletes, okay? That's not the same, that just doesn't happen, right? And so we need to start thinking about creating maternal cows that will continue in longevity and be in the herd and being that factory, and at the same time creating terminal animals that everything out of them is pounds weaned, carcass quality, and sold into the feed yards. Okay? If we are going to continue with this dichotomy of the packer saying more pounds, more profit, more, if we want to avoid doing that in our cow herd, we have to start thinking about the story differently. And I understand that 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when we started talking about rototerminal breeding systems or crossbreeding systems in general, it was, yeah, but then I have to have multiple breeds of bulls. Then I have to have multiple breeding pastures, and it was a labor and resource intensive. I understand that. But I'm here to tell you today, with the advent of artificial insemination, sex semen, genomic testing, we're past that. Okay? We're past the argument of its labor and cost and resource intensive. So, we talked about beef on dairy yesterday, right? Essentially, how they make these decisions, someone asked the question, but how they make these decisions is they take their cows, their dairy cows, and they look at their PTA for net merit. That's like their API, right? Like they look at that index that says this is what the profitability of my cow is. And they plot the distribution. And what they're doing is they're splitting that herd in half. Sometimes, depending on what they need for replacement, dairy replacement heifers, it shifts left or right, but they split that herd in half. And the top half, they breed either to sex semen or they use embryos to create elite maternal replacement heifers out of their best milking cows. They are selecting essentially the maternal cows, and they are ensuring that they get heifers out of those matings. And then at the back end, they're using terminal beef semen. It is literally a terminal crossbreeding program. That's what they're doing. And my argument is, why aren't we doing that? If the dairy industry has proven that it works, and it works well, why aren't we doing that? So Jordan Thomas is going to get up after me and talk a little bit about his contributions to this study, but he and I have submitted a grant to USDA, and it's titled, Stacking the Use of Modern Genomic and Sex Selection Technologies to Increase Adoption of Rototerminal Breeding Systems for Cattle. And it goes with this kind of if you build it, they will come mentality. So what we're doing is we have a living herd. I think Matt McDaniel's here, but we have a living herd at FSRC. If you've been with Mizzou for a while, it's now referred to as Cornet, where we are implementing this model because we want to show that it works. And what we did is we have all of them in Simmenthal's total herd enrollment program. They all have genomically enhanced DPDs. We're reporting phenotypes to the evaluation. And we are taking the distribution of that herd, we're splitting it at half. The ones that we deem are the most maternal-oriented cows are getting sex heifer semen, and the rest, terminal semen. So I alluded to this a little bit, but essentially what we decided is we want to use this as a living model to show that, that it works, but we also added in the second level of, in that terminal herd, we did use 50-50 male sex versus conventional semen just to look at sex semen conception rates, but the concept is still the same. And in the spring, so to compare this, the fall herd's about 150 head, and we're making that distinction based on genetics. But in the spring herd, because the typical beef model is to do it based on age, we're also doing it based on age in the spring. So instead of that maternal versus terminal cut being made based on genetics, all of the younger cows are getting bred maternal semen, and all of the older cows are getting terminal, okay? Traditionally, that argument comes into play because it's like, well, I don't want to put terminal semen in a heifer because she needs calving ease. And I don't disagree with that, but the beef industry's done a really good job at creating this thing we call a curve bender, right? So I can find a calving ease bull that's acceptable for use in a heifer that still is in the top 10% or so for the terminal, for TI. So we did that this fall, okay? And I do have the pregnancy results. Jordan and his team went and they preg checked the cows, and this is real data. So traditionally at Cornet, right, what we would have done is everything would have gotten bred AI, and it would have gotten bred conventional semen for replacement heifer selection, okay? And in that case, we would get a 73% conception via artificial insemination. So that would result in 55 heifers, or 110 pregnant, 50, and then half and half. 55 of them percent heifers and 55 of them bulls. And then everything else would be bred to a terminal bull, right? And we ended up with, I think, about 10 of them open. So 30 of them were bred to the bull, only 10 were open. That's a total of 150 head. But what we did last fall is we split it up. So we ended up getting a 57% conception rate via sexed heifer semen. And so now what you can see is that instead of only having one line up here, we got 43 of them pregnant to sexed heifer semen. And guess what? All of them are heifers. 55 of them were bred, let's just say this was conventional, if not to make it more complicated. We got 55 of them bred to terminal semen, split half and half. And then, this is true, 42 of them bred to the terminal cover bulls and left us with 10 open, okay? So you can see kind of how that falls out. So if I take that information, just kind of how we ended up, in that traditional model, and this is kind of what struck me when Dr. Tallman gave his presentation, when we use this type of model, we have steers that were supposed to be replacement heifers, but just happened to be male when they were born, right? And so what do we do with that? How does that come up in economics? Well, ending up, I went in and I looked at the actual bulls that we used, their EPDs for weaning weight, did the crossbreed adjustment, right? And then assumed a 50-pound difference between steers and heifers. And what it came out to be was we had 55 replacement heifers that were available, okay? That means over 36%. If everything got pregnant, we wanted to keep all of these heifers in a 150 head herd, we would have 36% replacement rate. Unless someone's doing something really wrong, right? You don't need all 36 to stay as replacements, but that's how many candidates you had. You had 55 maternal bred AI steers that weighed 550 pounds because we bred them to be replacements and their genetic potential for weaning weight was less. You would have had 15 terminal heifers born at an average weight of 526 pounds, and you would have had 15 terminal steers born at 576 pounds at weaning. So if we do that math, okay, that comes out to a little over almost 47,000 pounds. Current market sale prices I did a weighted average of what the heifers and the steers were selling for based on the numbers in here. That producer would have gotten a check for a little over $193,000. It seems like a good sale day, right? Now, let's look here. If we switch to a rototerminal breeding system and adopting technology, you would have 43 replacement heifer candidates for use. That's still almost a 30% replacement rate, okay? You would still have elite, they were all AI bred, right? So they're born early in the season. They're all candidates as replacement heifers. In this case, they're all red baldies, so they're crossbred. And you would have 0 maternal AI bred steers. I mean, you might have 1 or 2 because the technology is not perfect, but you get what I'm saying, right? Now, because you don't have those excess steers, those cow uteruses can be used in a different way, and you have 48 terminal heifers at 526 pounds, and you have 49 terminal steers at 576 pounds. $215,000. The end of the day, that check comes out to almost $150 of additional profit per head. Okay? So my challenge to you is, how can we adopt technology? This is just an example. There's multiple ways to go about doing something like this, but how can we adopt technology to give what the market motivation is telling us, but at the same time not detrimentally impacting our cow factory, right? So I think we're doing questions later, but that is my mantra for today.